Good afternoon. Welcome to our show. I'm your host, Melissa Ridgen. Imagine for a moment rolling into a little farm town in Saskatchewan and seeing a Nazi flag flying up someone's flagpole. And as if that's not enough, they've got a Confederate battle flag flapping up there too. And just in case you weren't sure what kind of person that you're dealing with, they covered all of the inflammatory bases, apparently. So what would you do? Well, Caleb Peltier didn't have to think long about it. The George Gordon First Nation band member climbed up the antenna and removed the flags. He burned them and did it live on Facebook, which 32,000 people have watched. That's just one of the issues that we're putting in focus today. Later in the show, we'll talk to a man who might blow your mind with the data on Indigenous business in Canada. And later, we're going to go back to Saskatchewan, which has among the highest HIV rates in all of North America. It's a crisis, and it's disproportionately affecting Indigenous people there. We want you to join in our conversation. That includes you listening on Element FM radio in Toronto and Ottawa. Our phone lines are open. All of you can phone us. Toll free, 1-877-647-2786. You can also tweet us at APTN InFocus. Before I introduce you to our guest, let's go to Kelleher, Saskatchewan, where a 34-year-old prize of human displayed the Nazi and Confederate flags. Here's how it began.
Symbols of hatred and white supremacy in rural Saskatchewan. The Nazi flag, along with a Confederate flag, fly above a house in Kelleher. The flags went up on Thursday, causing an outcry from some residents.
That's not right. I got a family and 2 kids, and we live just down the block from that, and that's not appropriate.
I just wish he'd take it down because it's going viral on Facebook and it's making the whole town look bad and look like we're all a bunch of racists. One, I myself is First Nation, and I've never had any of that in my entire life of living here.
The concern was so pronounced, the RCMP received several calls.
The members in the area did bring the concerns of the community forward to the resident and made them aware of the concerns of the community.
Kelleher is a town of around 220 people. The flag can be seen from a nearby retirement home and an elementary school. For the concerned residents, there is no legal recourse.
It's not illegal to fly a flag like that, despite the offensiveness of what people may think of it, but it is not illegal.
Some worry how the town will be perceived if the flags aren't taken down.
It's nice and calm here, but when they see stuff like that, it's going to be town gossip for sure, and it's something we should not be flying in our town for sure.
CTV News tried to contact the person responsible, but did not receive a response. The RCMP say that it is up to the resident to take down the flags, as it is an issue of free speech. Nathaniel Dove, CTV News, Kelleher.
Well, the resident didn't take down the flags, but Caleb Peltier is the 21-year-old from the George Gordon First Nation who did remove the flags, and then he burned them. The reaction has been worldwide, and while some applaud him as a hero for standing up against hate, others actually are condemning him for trespassing and have accused him of property destruction. Some have argued that it violates the flag flyer's freedom of expression. I chatted with Caleb yesterday about why he did what he did and what he hopes it accomplishes. Here's that conversation. So, Caleb, you saw last week in the news reports that a Nazi and a Confederate flag were flying in a little town called Kelleher. What happened next?
No, I seen it on Facebook, social media, and I kind of felt that was disrespectful. I mean, the 34-year-old male was asked to take it down politely from his mayor, let alone not from his mayor, but law enforcement. Mm-hmm. He said that he'd do it after it stopped raining. I think it was a day after I went out there.
After it stopped raining?
Yeah, and then I went to go see if they were still up, and sure enough, they were still up.
So then what did you do?
Then I proceeded to knock on the door. I was going to ask him nicely to take it down, see if we could be civil about it, but there was no answer, so I decided to climb up on his aerial antenna and take them down. They were zip tied on there, and I just ripped them down.
And so you took both of the flags down, then you went to Facebook Live to burn them. How come?
Just to show that this isn't a joke, you know, this is real life stuff. Hate and racism, it goes a long way. The flags contributed to our veterans fighting and losing their life before us, and there's a lot of reasons that can go hand in hand into the situation of why I did it.
How many views did that video get?
Oh, that's I don't know. It's global. I can tell you that. I can't tell you exactly how much.
So you've been to Kelleher numerous times in your life. And Kelleher is a little worried that they're getting a bad rap because these flags were flying in that community. Tell us a little bit about that town, people who live in that town, and your take on the people of Kelleher.
I can't really speak for the town of Kelleher and the people in Kelleher. I mean, but from what I see, I've met a few good people from there. I mean, some people believe in the wrong things, and sometimes you can't control what people do.
You think that there's some support for the gentleman who was flying these flags?
Oh yeah, absolutely. There's going to be people that agree with them totally 100%. No matter where we are, if we're in Kelleher, if we're in Saskatchewan alone, it's going to be all over the world. There's Nazis all over the world, Nazi supporters all over the world. I mean, but we're in Canada. We're not in 1940. We're in 2019, I believe. Mm-hmm. There's no room for hate and racism anymore. That should be left in the past, you know.
What's been the response the feedback that you've had since posting that video online? What sort of things have you heard from people?
Oh, I've heard almost everything in the book you can think of. I mean, a lot of people hate me, but then again, the nation's behind me on this.
What sort of? Well, you said that some of the feedback you've got is from people who hate you. What are they saying? What type of messages are they sending you?
They're just saying, like, what you did was wrong. You know, you went and trespassed it. You went and vandalized his house, basically. But little do they know, I didn't do anything to his house, to his property. Maybe climbed up his aerial antenna. I didn't bend his aerial antenna at all. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's just people not agreeing with what I did. I mean, but that's the world we live in these days. I mean, some people are going to love us for what we do, and some people are going to hate us for the choices we make to do. Yeah.
Are you worried about being charged? You haven't heard from the police so far, but is that something that weighs on your head?
No, not at all. I'm not scared to go to jail for this, for standing up for something I believe that is right.
Well, Caleb, thanks for taking the time out to talk with us about this incident. We're still following it here at APTN, and I appreciate you taking the time to share that.
Yeah, no problem. I'll stand up before I shut up any day.
Love it. Stand up before I shut up. I like it. So Caleb Peltier was an actual hashtag on Twitter this week, although, as you heard him say, he got some hate in private messages. The support that he's received has mostly been positive publicly. Let's take a look at just what some of the tweets are saying about him taking down the Nazi and Confederate flags and the hashtag he's become globally responsible for. So we start out with Rachel, who says, Caleb Peltier, thank you for taking down that hideous flag. The Nazi swastika will always be an affront to humanity. This symbol means genocide to me. As a Jew, it represents the worst in humanity. That someone thought it was okay to display it in public view is beyond me. Hashtag love wins. Omar says, I'm sure the Canadian soldiers who died serving in World War II would salute that man if they could. And we heard that Caleb actually brought that up. That was part of the reason why he went to take that down, was just thinking about the veterans who died fighting against the Nazis. Rourke says, I'm proud of my German heritage, but I'd never fly a damn Nazi flag over my home or even own one. What those monsters did was absolutely unforgivable, and anyone who openly celebrates them deserves no less than imprisonment or death, lest history repeat itself. From the Meathead, if Caleb Peltier gets charged by the RCMP for burning a Nazi flag, we need to reevaluate our hate laws in Canada, because we actually fought a world war against Nazism already, and we shouldn't have to do it again. Evan says, Caleb Peltier is a gem. Thanks for standing against this plague of hate that everyone seems to just ignore. Captain Dick in Saskatchewan says, a Saskatchewan man rips the flag down, burns the Nazi flag flying on a house. That flag is illegal in France, Germany, and other allied countries. It should be illegal to fly it here in Canada out of respect for our grandparents who died or were maimed fighting against it. Taylor says, the village mayor going to talk to the parents of a 34-year-old racist who put up the Nazi flag while living in his grandfather's house is basically an episode of Corner Gas if it had been set in real-life Saskatchewan. Not all posts supported the action, though. Ian says, rights to property, privacy, and expression rightfully permit Nazis and everyone else to proclaim their sympathies within their habitations. I guess that means homes. These rights define civil order and should be sacrosanct. And I hate Nazis, but love freedom more. The vandal who removed the flag should be jailed. Wow. We want to broaden the discussion about this incident to actually include race relations in Saskatchewan, which of course had come into question a couple of years ago in the high-profile Colton Boushie case. What is it like to be living as an Indigenous person in rural areas and in the cities? You know, keeping in mind that this is the place where tensions flared after Colton Boushie, an Indigenous man, was shot and killed by a farmer just a couple of years ago, and that farmer walked free. Joining me now in studio is Councillor Fabian Iron Eagle from Pasqua, a First Nation surrounded by Saskatchewan's grain belt. Eleanor Sunchild, a Cree lawyer from the Thunderchild First Nation in West Central Saskatchewan, I guess we could, Central Saskatchewan. And Cameo Capo of the Muscopeding First Nation. You might remember that he recorded himself being thrown out of a Canadian Tire store in Regina after being accused of theft when he was there shopping for a chainsaw with a friend back in 2017. I thank all of you guys for joining us. So I want to say, you know, what this incident's garnered international attention. Once again, all eyes are on Saskatchewan. I want to hear from each of you. What's it like living in Saskatchewan as a First Nations person?
Well, for me, I think it's, you know, when we talk about racism, it's always been there. It's always below the surface. Everything that we do, wherever we go, there's certain situations we're put in as a First Nations person where you can actually feel it sometimes, where people don't like you. And you know, from my position as a political person, in the business dealings that we do, we face it all the time. Like, I'll give you an example. When we do business deals, and as soon as they know that it's a First Nation that's coming to purchase land or parcels of land, the price goes up automatically. You know, they raise the prices on us because they're dealing with First Nations. So it's always a challenge. There was an incident in Fort Capel some years back in the 90s. I don't know if you recall, when there was a Sasktel worker who was murdered in one of the First Nations. And that created a lot of racial tension in Fort Capel, and my children were small at the time, and I remember taking them to Houston Pizza for supper. Mm-hmm. So, and my children were small at the time. They were like 8, 9 years old. And just walking in there, you could feel that energy. It just was not a very good feeling. So being a First Nations person, I guess it's kind of been the norm, you know, growing up. We've always faced it. It's politicians, you know, mask it, is the way I see it. You know, it's there. It's in the justice system. We see it all the time. Like I said, it's right there in front of us all the time.
Eleanor, you walk this earth as an Indigenous woman in a chunk of this earth that is known as Saskatchewan. What's your experience there?
It's different living in Saskatchewan than going elsewhere. You're always in the back of your mind on guard for racism and discrimination. You can tell when somebody has that attitude towards you, or your children. I have children. So I know when I'm being looked down on or they're being looked down on. So, and I'll say something. You know what? Not everybody has a voice to say something. And there's parts of Saskatchewan where you don't go. And a lot of those areas are the rural areas, just because it's not safe, especially in the wake of what happened to Colton. It gave people a permission to be more open with their racism, and they are, as you see by this display of the Nazi flag.
Cameo, you live in, we've just been talking about rural areas. You're from a rural area, but you're living in Regina. Explain to us how you feel in an actual city, in an urban center, living as a First Nations man.
Oh, actually, I live on the reserve, so
sorry.
Quite a bit, so yeah. Well, I deal with a lot of ranchers also because I have a horse business, and the racism has always been there, as Fabian and Elder mentioned. It's increased since the Colton Bushi case. Maybe it's not so much as increased, but it's become more obvious, and people, as Elder mentioned, have more feel they have more permission to do what they like. There was a case just last year. There was some Indian friends from the Muskogee First Nation. They were traveling, and they had a flat tire, and they couldn't fix it. So rather than stop at a farmer's place like we would have done in the past, they just kept traveling until they got to another First Nation, and then they received help there. So people are quite aware that those doors are no longer open and that you risk being shot at. And like my son, too, when we're traveling, if anything goes wrong, he says, hey, man, don't pull in there, you'll get a shot. And that's a real concern now.
That's, Fabian, when we were talking earlier, you said that these tensions, this racial divide, I guess. Do you see that it goes both ways?
I believe so. You know, when I think about racism, I think about from our end and from a non-First Nations point of view, and I think a lot of it has to do with just the ignorance, people not knowing. Like a lot of non-Native people don't know who we are, and then we get labeled a lot. You know, they call us all kinds of names because they think
I've heard a lot of them.
You know, the government gives us handouts and all of that kind of information, which is misinformation.
Yeah.
You know, they don't realize the history of who we are as First Nations people, and the reason why we, you know, our fight. You know, it's always a fight for us. But at the same time, too, you know, we have First Nations people that are racist against non-Native people. You know, so it's.
And what's the basis of that? Is it just because, you know, it's a minority population that's consistently beaten down by people in Saskatchewan, and so the response is just carte blanche, write them all off? Is that what's behind it, or is it something different?
I think it's all a form of that oppression that you know, that's happened to our people over the years. You know, our First Nations people have been oppressed, and we're starting to stand up. We're starting to be acknowledged for not just who we are, but what we are and what we're capable of doing. Mm-hmm. And now I just kind of see where it's just frustration. You know, it's people get frustrated. It's always an ongoing fight, you know, to try and be heard. Mm-hmm. And that's just the way I kind of see that. But like I said, it's that form of oppression, and then, you know, our people are reacting to that.
We do see on our social media, I know I've seen a lot of people say, hey, it isn't just one way. We need to stop with the whole whitey is doing this or that. So I do hear that from other people. I wanted to ask you, Eleanor, you've made a comment about kind of the silent allies in Saskatchewan. Talk a little bit about that.
Well, there are a lot of non-Native people who are allies, and some of them are very vocal with their support. Some of them condemn hatred, condemn the comments that came as a result of the Gerald Stanley trial and all the hatred that we've seen result from there. Mm-hmm. But there's a larger group of non-Native people who are silent. They won't say anything unless it's behind closed doors or in a small group or one-on-one, but publicly they just remain silent. And it's probably because they think, well, it's not my fight, it's not my issue, so why should I say anything? But how are things going to change if people don't start speaking up for what they believe in, or if they see there's a wrong, then speak up and say something, because we need them to back us up.
Yep. We have a caller. Are you there, caller? Teresa, are you there?
Oh, hi.
Hey, how are you?
Not too bad right now.
Got a question or a comment?
Yes. Something that has to do with that Germany flag.
Yeah.
I, for one, disagree on that part, too, because they're not supposed to do that, aren't they, in this country? They don't have a right.
To fly the flag?
Yeah. And yet they think they have, but I, for one, disagree with them. Them people, because they don't belong in our country in the first place. And why would they want to put up with their flag in our country after all these years?
I don't know that it's somebody who's from Germany who was there flying that flag. I don't know that that's the case. It could be very well somebody who was a settler born and raised many generations ago of settlers that came here. I mean, that flag isn't specific to people of Germany. It's been embraced by hateful people around the world. What do you think about, do you think it's acceptable to remove a flag like that and to burn it? Oh, did we lose Teresa? Yeah, we've lost Teresa. Okay, I want to go back to Cameo. Just to circle back on the race relations that exist in Saskatchewan is what we're talking about today. I'm sure we could have this conversation and do a show about every province, probably. Cameo, I want you to tell us quickly about an incident that happened at your son's school.
Yes, last year there was a young man. He was black, and he attended the same school as my son in Balgonie, Saskatchewan, a provincial high school. And he was bullied throughout the whole school year. And my son would come home, and he would be really upset, and he would say, "Dad, why are they so mean to this black kid in school?" And he would he'd tell me how they'd call him the N-word and different things. And I told my son, "Don't you let that happen. If you see them bullying him, you just jump in there and help him. And no matter what happens to you, you jump in there and you help him." And then the black boy started to fight back. He tolerated it for 2 or 3 months. Then he started to fight back. And once he started fighting, it just kept escalating, and he had to fight more and more because he was only in grade 9 and 14 years old, and the other boys in the higher grades he might win one fight, but then they'd beat him up on the right after that. And so in this one incident, he on a Friday he got in a fight with this one kid, and he won the fight, and 2 other kids jumped in and beat him up, and the police were called, and they hauled Caleb away. And the next Monday, Caleb killed himself. And nothing was ever done about this. I put this on social media. I talked with the principal. I talked with the school board, and no one ever did anything. And it's hard for me to conceptualize that I, in a sense, took part in this, that I didn't do anything. I knew this was going on. My son was number of times told me about this what this boy was experiencing, and then he killed himself. And like I said, nothing was ever done. Nobody did a single thing to step in and say, even after he committed suicide, and like it was all washed away and this is carpet.
This is sorry. What's the town that this happened in? This is
Balgonie, Saskatchewan.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it just.
How's your son doing after that?
Oh, he was quite traumatized by it, and he still is today. And he's cried a lot of times, and and my daughter too. They've seen how racism kills. It was right in front of their eyes. So.
Cameo, when you leave Saskatchewan, do you notice a difference I'm sure you do business, you're in the horse business, you must come to Manitoba, you must go to Alberta, probably even into the States. Do you notice, is there a difference how you're treated as a First Nations man?
I would say when I travel west and when I go past Manitoba and past Thunder Bay, Ontario, there's less racism, but Thunder Bay, Ontario and Manitoba and Saskatchewan, they're vying for the position of the most racist populations in Canada right now, I would say, because it's thick. You can feel it and you can see it all around you. Mm-hmm. And one thing I want to say was that my Uncle Fabian there, he was an example of me when I was a young man of how to deal with racism. He walked right in there and he presented himself as a strong, independent, I don't know if he knows that, but he just presented himself as that, and he never took a back seat to anybody. And and even with Eleanor, she's a lawyer, so when she walks in, she's confident, and people like this draw that kind of resentment from people because they're so confident. They're not used to seeing our people that confident when they go places in public, even amidst all the racism.
So I want to ask, Fabian, you've been around for a while?
I've been around for a while.
Been around for a while. Are you seeing, is the situation improving? Is it the same? Is it getting worse in terms of racial tensions, race relations?
Honestly, I think the awareness is out there. I think people know how to behave in terms of, it's always there. It's just beneath the surface. It's always there, and you feel. It's like what Camille had said, is you feel it.
Yeah.
But I mean, do you tolerate it? I don't. And I mean, it's also something that I've taught my children, and now teaching my grandchildren. It's really unfortunate that we have to do that, to teach our children that, rather than, I have some non-native friends, that are good friends of mine, and I mean, that's just the way the world is for us, and they're my friends, and they always will be, but there's, unfortunately, there's a lot of them that are out there that are not that way.
We really should have better things to do and better things to talk about at this stage of the game, right? Eleanor, tell me, you're involved in a film that's coming out in June. Tell us a little bit about it.
It's called We Will Stand Up, and it's a film by Tasha Hubbard. She filmed right from the first court appearance of Gerald Stanley up until when we went to the UN, and I'm not going to give the story away. However, it tells the story of Colton Boushie's family and why they were so upset about the verdict that acquitted Gerald Stanley. And it really needs to be seen by everybody, because then you will see the hatred that we experienced in Saskatchewan as a result of that, and other Indigenous people as well. It all came to a surface after that trial, and people are just more open with it now.
And it's on, you can see it. It's not hearing anecdotal stories about it. There's cameras rolling.
Yeah, you can see it.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's a really powerful film.
When's it out?
I believe it comes to Winnipeg June 5th.
June 5th.
There's a website.
What's the website?
Or it's not a website, a Facebook page.
Called?
It's called, sorry, my Cree is a little rusty. It's called We Will Stand Up.
Nipiwis Tamawin.
Yeah.
Tamawin? We'll find it on Facebook. Okay, we need to take a quick break. I thank you guys so much for joining us. Thank you, Cameo, for joining us by phone. So when we come back, we spend a lot of time talking about the struggles, our struggles, the challenges of our people. And occasionally we do talk about the accomplishments against the odds. But what about big, giant, successful Indigenous business? We don't talk nearly enough about that. What industries and fields are we moving into? How are we doing locally, nationally, globally? I've got a guest coming on next who has those answers and some statistics that just might knock your mocks off. Stay with us. Join our conversation now. You can call in toll-free at 1-877-647-2786. Like and watch us live on the APTN News Facebook page. Follow and tweet us at APTN InFocus, and send your thoughts in an email to infocus@aptn.ca. Welcome back, and that includes you, our listeners on Element FM radio in Toronto and Ottawa. As I was saying before the break, that we too often focus on the struggles and the challenges of our people, and maybe not enough on the big, massive successes. I'm not talking about small businesses that we sometimes profile. I'm talking like really big, Indigenous-owned and run companies. The Canadian Council for Aboriginal Business is an umbrella group with more than 700 Indigenous-owned business members. The Council builds bridges between Indigenous and non-Indigenous businesses and communities with the goal of respect and shared prosperity for all. JP Gladue is the President and CEO of the Canadian Council for Aboriginal Business, and I spoke with him earlier this week about what's happening in the corporate sector for our people. Here's that interview. It's got some interesting stats, so listen carefully. So, JP, tell us a bit about what exactly the Canadian Council for Aboriginal Business does, kind of in plain terms for Indigenous people who may not know.
Sure, the CCAB has been around for 37 years, and really we're about building the space for Indigenous and non-Indigenous businesses to come together to create opportunities. So we do that through our programs, our events, and our research. We actually have the best research in the world on an Indigenous economy, and we've got this great narrative of a strengthening economy in the Indigenous community. And now we're able to back up a lot of the work that we do through the data. And you know, at the end of the day, we're trying to strengthen the whole concept of what economic reconciliation looks like. And in my view, economic reconciliation is when our communities are no longer managing poverty, but start managing wealth. And then it's creating the opportunities to generate that wealth through the business lens.
I love it. And so can you give us a snapshot of what Indigenous business looks like across the Canadian landscape? I mean, it seems like that's a big concept, and you would think it would look different everywhere. But, you know, for people who are wondering what's Indigenous business look like, give us a little bit of a sampling as we move across the country.
Sure. I mean, let's start at the very top when we think about the contributions of our people to the economy. In 2016, it was about $32 billion. I suspect, you know, as we update those numbers, it'll be significantly higher than that. And of that is about $12+ billion coming from our Indigenous businesses from coast to coast to coast. There are over 60,000 entrepreneurs from our communities, men and women that are contributing to their families, to their communities. There's a lot of bench strength in Western Canada for sure, and in eastern part of the country there's a growing Indigenous presence in the business community. We've got everything from, you know, 1-2 person shops working at their kitchen tables doing consulting, all the way to community development corporations that are generating $600-700 million a year in annual revenue. One of the women we just celebrated here in Toronto in April, Nicole Bork-Boucher from the Boucher Group. She started her company with her husband. She's from Mikisew Cree, Dave's from Fort McKay. They started their business 16-17 years ago, started off with negative $250,000 in the hole, and this year they'll be generating over $170 million in revenue, 1,100 people working for them, 400 plus of them are Indigenous. You know, we've got engineers, we've got architects, we've got printing companies, we have IT companies, a lot in the construction firms, road construction. So it's really diverse, and I think it's Canada's best kept secret. I think that Canadians need to understand the power of the Indigenous economy and the contributions that we are making, but not only just to the economy, but to the certainty of this country, which we can talk a little bit about as well if you'd like.
I love that. That's 60,000 entrepreneurs. That's crazy. I wonder, from you, part of your mandate is to, quote, reset old stereotypes with new business realities. So what is the biggest misconception for the business landscape for Indigenous people that you hear?
Well, you know, there's a lot of biases against our people. There's still a lot of racism against our people, and people that are just ignorant of who we are, just haven't taken the time, don't realize that our capacity has grown immensely. We've got some of the brightest minds that are doing incredible business. So we're not in this box where we're there's nothing wrong with a gas station. We have gas stations, but we have engineering firms like all these firms that I've been sharing with you. And so Canadians just have to open up their eyes a little bit more to the idea that there is a growing Indigenous economic engine. The natural resource sector gets it because they've been having to accommodate and consult with our communities for a long time. And they know that in order for them to build their businesses, they've got to develop them in concert with our communities and our Indigenous businesses. And so, but getting to the average Canadian, and sometimes even our own people, and understanding that there is a pathway to empowerment through business development is something that still isn't penetrating the Canadian psyche as deep as I would and many of our colleagues would like to see.
So, and there is a belief among some people, including Indigenous people, but certainly non-Indigenous people too, that Indigenous people are anti-business. What does your group, what does CCAB do to combat that?
Well, I always like to remind Canadians and sometimes our own people that Canada's first economic engine was powered by our people. We had an economy even before the newcomers came. We knew trade. We had technology like canoes. The Inuit had their sunglasses, chewing gum. We had commerce and medicine through our plants, through our animals, through our furs. And then when the newcomers came, we traded with them, and it had global implications. Now the idea is to try and find that pathway, and we are, quite handedly, I'd say, in a modern context. But as I say, we've still got a ways to go. If our people are contributing $32 billion to Canada's economy, that is pretty strong. But still, that's only about 1.5% of the total GDP, and we represent 5% of the population. So if we're talking about a $90 to $100 billion economy, business and entrepreneurship and procurement, all those things are going to have to play a stronger role in filling that gap to empower our communities. And business it's self-empowering, and so we're Canada's first entrepreneurs. We're strong. We proliferate in everything that we do in business, and we'll continue to do so. And again, communities that have stronger economies, I would dare say, experience less of the challenges that many of our communities face around poverty, addictions, etc. So when you have your own power through an economy, you can drive decisions in a way that suits your community rather than being dependent on government programs all the time, which are also very important, but it's better than if we can actually generate our own revenue.
I'm curious to know there's challenges whether you're on reserve or you're off reserve, if this is a community-owned business or if it's an individual who's off reserve who owns a business. But there's got to be some certain challenges too if you are a remote First Nation. Is there any room for you in the business landscape? I mean, what would you do if you're not close to an urban hub?
Right. I mean, the wonderful thing about the future of work is that it is evolving. It probably drives you crazy just as much as it drives me crazy when somebody says, why don't those communities just move? 10,000 plus years in the land, you're not just going to move. So the potential in unlocking our communities is really what we need to be working towards. And so broadband, because if you're an engineer, or an architect or an accountant, we work anywhere, and so the ability to fly in and out of your community, to take the work back to your community and generate an economy is the possibilities are there. There's often it's location, location, location. So when you're in northern communities, there's sometimes mining opportunities, there's forestry opportunities, sometimes there's oil and gas. But if those are not around, it's absolutely one of the biggest challenges I think our country faces in our communities in empowering those communities through jobs and through entrepreneurship. But again, if we don't unlock them with clean drinking water, with renewable or dependable energy, broadband, it's very hard to unlock that potential and to draw back the community members that go get educated to bring back that knowledge base, that brain trust back to the community. So we've got a ways to go in that area.
I'd heard somebody at a conference I was at not long ago talk about maybe the answer to some economic freedom is a greater investment in businesses. Maybe you don't have a business that's in your remote community, but you certainly have band members who have potential, who are maybe not living in the community, who are somewhere else, or there's partnership opportunities where these remote communities can invest and start building some wealth. Is that something that CCAB is involved with, is linking up communities like that, potential investors, with businesses?
Yeah, so there's a number of tools that we have that support Indigenous entrepreneurs, and I'll run through a few of them right now. But we also have some great organizations out there like NACA, for instance, the National Aboriginal Capital Corporation Association, which helps finance these startups or the growth opportunities for the communities. Where CCAB plays an important role is we have a program called TFAB, Tools and Financing for Aboriginal Businesses. So it's a bunch of buckets that are designed to support the growth and startup of growth of entrepreneurs. Things like mentorship, things like cash flow income statements. The other thing that we have is our supply chain initiative. You can have the best business in the world, whether you're producing whatever widget that is or service, but if you can't get it to market, that obviously can be detrimental to your business if you can't sell it. So we've got a procurement strategy called Aboriginal Procurement Marketplace and the Supply Chain initiatives where we're creating a space for business opportunities to come together, so that you can place them on the on this platform, which is powered by Teal Books, one of our partners. So you can put all those contracting opportunities in there that are designed or at least made for Indigenous entrepreneurs to bid on. You know, back to my earlier comments about these biases that sometimes pop up. So as an example, you know, the private sector is really, particularly in the natural resource sector, gets it. They've been spending a lot of time in helping co-develop and support our Indigenous businesses through contracts, etc. And as one example, Suncor, they spent $700 million last year on Indigenous entrepreneurs. In the oil and gas sector, as an example, in 1 year there's $3.3 billion spent on Indigenous entrepreneurs and community development corporations. And what that actually looks like in a community is, for instance, Fort McKay First Nation, their annual salary is over $73,500 a year. Compare that to the average Canadian of around $38,000, and the average Albertan, to put that in some geographic perspective, about $50,000. You can see how Indigenous entrepreneurs are really empowering a community and a province, for that matter. Unfortunately, our government friends still haven't quite got it right. In 2017, they spent about $16.4 billion through their supply chains, but only 0.32% of their spend was directed at Aboriginal entrepreneurs, which translated to about a $65 million contribution to our entrepreneurs. And it's really a business relationship. Well, if they were to target 5%,
sorry, just last week you were asking them for more to increase that procurement spending with Aboriginal businesses to 5%. So explain to us what it's at now and why it needs to increase.
Well, it's at 0.32%, and that's about $65 million. If they were to hit 5%, which is representative of our population, that would contribute $740, $750 million to our Indigenous entrepreneurs. And as I've just mentioned, you can see the economic impact that has in the community where people are thriving. And so, but again, there's this bias. And governments sometimes, and even industry, don't think that we've got the capacity. Well, why CCAB's research becomes incredibly important is because we were able to compare with all the research data that we have against all the government NAICS codes, which was all in our database. We were able to prove that our Indigenous businesses' net capacity is over 24%. So not only can we hit 5, but our net capacity is over 24%. So that's a strong indicator that our Indigenous entrepreneurs are ready for their business, but they got to change the policies, and they've got to make sure that they're streamlining the way that they do business, because sometimes these supply chains are very cumbersome to work through.
I thank you so much for taking the time today to share this with us. I've always been very curious what you guys are up to at CCAB, and I'm sure that people watching and listening today are happy to know that you guys are out there fighting the fight for them.
Thank you, Melissa, for taking the interest. It was a real pleasure.
Of business for Indigenous people in Canada. We need to take a quick break, but stick around. When we come back, AIDS and HIV in Saskatchewan is a crisis for our people. That province has among the highest rates of infection in North America, and it's getting worse. That's after the break. Welcome back. Last week, investigative reporter John Murray reported on the HIV epidemic in Saskatoon. His documentary, Living Exposed, aired on Friday on APTN Investigates. Let's take a look.
When I contracted HIV 20 years ago, that vastly changed my life. And then there was those precautions of blood. It's a bloodborne pathogen, so I was quite afraid of infecting other people if I got an injury or anything. So I thought it would be best for me to retire, and I did.
Lynn got HIV at a time when mostly men were exposed.
It was known as a gay man's disease. Gay white male man disease is no longer that, and especially in our province of Saskatchewan. It's actually a young women Aboriginal disease. Our young women are contracting it at phenomenal rates.
All right.
Jason Mercurdy, Executive Director of AIDS Saskatoon, has worked in the community for years.
Men who have sex with men make up about 4% of new HIV infections. Predominantly it's people who are injecting drugs, but then the number two is people having heterosexual sex unprotected. And so, but I would say number one with a bullet for the last 10 plus years has been injection drug use.
Statistics show that Indigenous people are most commonly among the newly infected, and as of 2016, the gender gap for infections had closed, with males now making up just 56%. For Lynn, the ball diamond wasn't the only thing gone from her life.
I was shunned, very much shunned from my community, lost many friends. Often had people spit on me, yell at me, call me a diseased bitch. It was like I might as well have just put HIV on my forehead. And it's still that way today.
The reporter behind that documentary is APTN Investigates' John Murray, who joins us now from Edmonton. Hi, John.
Hi, Melissa. Thanks for having me on the show.
Yeah, I want to know what about the issue of HIV/AIDS in Saskatoon is newsworthy right at this time?
Well, as my documentary focused on, there are the social, economic factors of it, which they call social determinants of health. Just looking at life with HIV. But there's also a lot of health reporting that really needs to go on. There's a lot of questions about unequal access to meds across the provinces and then through NIHB, looking at Indigenous traditional methods and some of the realities in harm reduction, such as the slow pace at getting them implemented and the accountability on that pace. And of course, we need to follow up on some of these other stories, such as one that was reported on last year.
Yeah. Saskatoon has a needle program, I believe, yet the infection rates are climbing. What's going on?
Well, needle exchange programs vary on what they provide, and in Saskatoon they have what's called needle exchanges with accountability, or it's otherwise known as a one-to-one needle exchange, which may not necessarily completely discourage needle sharing. I mean, if you have a group of 3 people and one person is only willing to go to the needle exchange, you're not really preventing them from sharing that needle. So one of the things SaskHealth and AIDS Saskatoon has started to implement is promoting the use of pipes. So that's one of the ways that we can move forward to help alleviate some of these concerns with needle exchanges. But of course, again, like I mentioned before, there's funding sources and it's the slow pace of implementation.
So do we know, something else that I actually learned from your story is that Indigenous people account for 80% of the new infections in Saskatchewan. And many of them are women. The woman who you'd interviewed in your documentary had said, it was known as a gay man's disease for a long time, but it's no longer that, especially in Saskatchewan. It's actually a young Aboriginal woman's disease. Our women are contracting it at a phenomenal rate, is what she'd said. What's going on? Why? Why Indigenous women, young Indigenous women?
Well, I think a large part of that is something that they call know your status, which means know if you have an HIV infection. And, and sometimes, going to the doctor and just getting tested might be difficult when a person is compounding that with another illness, such as addiction.
That makes sense. So last summer, there was a team of British Columbia researchers actually had released findings that show that there are mutated strains of HIV found only in Saskatchewan, and that these mutated strains are making people sicker way faster. So basically the disease is progressing, advancing to AIDS faster. But it's only a problem if you're infected with HIV, but you're not being treated. So these drugs will respond the same as regular HIV strains to medication, but if you don't know you have it, you're not getting treated for it, and so that disease will advance faster. I spoke with one of the researchers from BC yesterday and was hoping that she could join our discussion today, but she's actually presenting at a conference all day. I wonder, did you talk to people on the front lines who are talking about the challenges of getting people to reduce the spreading of this virus? Like, how do you get people in to get tested? How do you get people not sharing needles, not having unprotected sex. Like, what on the ground is happening on all of those fronts, I guess, to stave off the spread and the skyrocketing numbers associated with HIV?
Well, I think largely what's happening is they're doing education campaigns, trying to get people to know their status and to help stop the spread of the infection. You know, but there's also a shame and stigma that's attached to it. So I think, you know, to a certain extent, there may be some people that don't even want to know. But even on that aspect, again, like I mentioned before, there's also that idea of illness, you know, impacting getting diagnosed for another illness. You know, it's about what's important. And you know, and on top of that, when you're in an Indigenous community and you find out a diagnosis like this and you're obligated to share it with other people, you know, in Indigenous communities, they're quite small. There's no secrets.
Yeah, and I think too, if you compound with all of this, if you're struggling with addiction, you know, getting to your doctor to get tested, these aren't things that are naturally things that are first and foremost in your mind when your biggest thing is when you're getting your next hit. Thanks, John, so much for joining us. We got to run. It's always a pleasure to talk to you and our friends at APTN Investigates.
Absolutely, thank you.
We are out of time for this afternoon. I want to say a huge thanks to all of our guests who joined for these important topics today, and to you, our viewers, and of course our listeners on Element FM radio in Toronto and Ottawa. This episode will be available for download as a podcast on our website. I'm Melissa Ridgen. Have a great afternoon. I'll see you back here next week.